recently released books in Caribbean Studies to South Florida to give public-facing talks on their work. This also has a component of supporting the creation of new open educational resources, a key goal of dLOC at the present. Specifically, these talks are recorded and made available via the dLOC repository at www.dloc.com, the dLOC YouTube channel, and as audio via the New Books Network podcast. I just want to point out we have the great pleasure to have a dLOC partner in the room today, Antonio Marcelli from the Institut du Salvaguard du Patrimoine National in Cap Haitian, Haiti. Very proud to work with them as always. And now I will turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Ramona LaRoche from the African American Research Library and Cultural Center. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. Good evening, everyone. We thank you so much for being here. We are so excited looking around to see that you saw that it was not robbery to be here tonight. My name is Ramona LaRoche, and I serve as the Director of Adult Reference Services here. And we at ARLIC are really excited about the programming and all the work we've done over the last almost 22 years. We're still really amazed that sometimes people live right here and haven't been here. So part of your mission that we're asking you today is to help spread the word of what we're doing here at ARLIC. We have so many programs, and I won't even go into the details. There are some flyers and we have QR codes around, but I will tell you that we need your help. We need you to help get more people here. We need young people here, we need old people here, we need everyone here. We're an amazing building. Our special collections and archives. If you need research, we have it. So please come back. Look and see what we're doing. Go on YouTube. Look at some of our programs on YouTube. It's been exciting. I've been here almost 6 years, and I can't think of a lovelier place to come to every day. So without further ado, I'm not going to talk more about programs. I'm just going to bring on our director, Dr. Tamika Hobbs.
Thank you very much, Ramona. Welcome, everyone. It is very good to see so many of you here tonight. I am absolutely thrilled about this continued partnership with FIU. They have been really wonderful on a number of different levels. They have helped us with our book festivals. They have, and I should shout out Ramona for her leadership in the community data project that has been ongoing for 3 years, that's right now coming to a conclusion. As a result of that partnership with the FIU Wolfsonian Digital Humanities Lab, Public Humanities Lab, we've been able to digitize and increase the availability of portions of our collection. And so when I say that it's just been a really fruitful and wonderful relationship with FIU, please know that it has, and this iteration with dLOC is incredibly special. It was a very easy yes. This is being folded into one of our series of programs called Cultural Conversations, where we engage filmmakers, authors, scholars of all sorts to create a more intimate conversation and space for us to come in and talk. And so we're very glad I should say, to have Dr. Boaz with us this evening to do that. I want to piggyback on something that Dr. Ramona said. It's always interesting to me to know, show of hands, how many people are here for the first time? Anyone? We do have a few first timers. Well, welcome to you. As she said, we're 21 years old. We were founded as a part of Broward Public Library System to intentionally collect, protect, preserve, interpret, and celebrate the history of African descended people. We have the privilege tonight of having with us the visionary behind ARLIC, none other than Sam Morrison. Hello, Sam. Grateful for him and his work and what he did to plant the seed for this wonderful institution. I also want to recognize Tanya Simons-Opara, who was a part of that group. Fundraising, organizing, making trips to the continent of Africa to make sure that everything that went into this building was right and proper and accurate. And so I just want to acknowledge them. This is the final installment in what has been a series of programs celebrating Haitian Heritage Month. I know all the signage and the title says African American, but I always like to let people know that the way we interpret that is people of African descent, no matter where you're from. And so this has been a second year that we've done this. We started at the beginning of the month with the production of a theatrical play called Once on This Island that was actually set in Haiti. We had 320 packed all the seats in our auditorium across the hall to have those high school students of Haitian descent come in and have a really wonderful experience and celebration. We followed that with an observance of Haitian Flag Day on May 18th. We have our guest speaker here, Dr. Rudy Jambar, did an outstanding job in helping us to connect and learn more about Haitian history and really understand why we all should appreciate and celebrate that occasion. And tonight, with Dr. Boaz, we are very, very happy to be able to present her lecture. I can't wait to hear it. I want to thank her for being here. Again, Katie, Enrique, and everyone at FIU, thank you for your partnership. I look forward to more. And for all of you, please find an excuse to come back and be with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tamika and Ramona, and I'll echo, please be on the lookout for all of the wonderful programs here at ARLIC. I feel very fortunate to live so close in Plantation specifically, and they always do an incredible job. So without further ado, I'm going to present our speaker for this evening. Today, we have the great fortune to have Dr. Danielle N. Boaz, Associate Professor of Africana Studies at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. Dr. Boaz is the author of Voodoo, The History of a Racial Slur, released in 2023 from Oxford University Press and available for checkout here, the Miami-Dade Public Library Edison branch near Little Haiti, and FIU's Green Library. Dr. Boaz earned her PhD in African Diaspora, Caribbean, and African History from the University of Miami, so we're very happy to welcome her back to South Florida. So without further ado, Dr. Danielle N. Boaz.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you to everybody here at the African American Research Library Cultural Center. I'm so excited to be here for the first time. I'm a first-timer in this amazing space, and I'm so happy to be here with all of you. Thank you for coming out tonight, and I hope to not disappoint with the talk here. So I want to start out this evening by giving you an idea about why I do the work I do before getting into what exactly it is that I work on. And just by way of explanation very quickly, so we've got a complex setup here where I'm looking over here to make sure what slide I'm on, and then I'm also looking at my phone to remember what I'm talking to you about. So I'm just not texting or anything, but just trying to keep up with what I'm looking at here. All right, so I wanted to start off and talk to you about a devastating incident that happened in 2010, which I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, remember, which is the earthquake in Haiti that killed hundreds of thousands of people, injured and displaced millions of people. Now, why am I starting with this point? Because after the earthquake happened, there were a series of attacks on Voodoo practitioners, and I'm going to use the terminology of Voodoo, V-O-D-O-U. This is how devotees of Haitian, what we often call Voodoo, prefer to refer to themselves, prefer to spell the religion, to spell the name of the religion, and so I'm using that terminology to distinguish from the term Voodoo that we're going to talk about in depth tonight. So following the 2010 earthquake, we have reports from scholars and religious leaders that devotees were experiencing all kinds of discrimination. Immediately after the earthquake, as they gathered, as many religious communities did, to hold ceremonies and to just honor the people who had departed and pray for the people who were injured, devotees were pelted with rocks, people were urinating on their sacred objects, and just chasing them away as they tried to gather. And over time, this really escalated. And what we hear is that, I don't remember the exact statistics, but I know that the vast majority of the aid that went to Haiti to rebuild, to help people who were displaced and injured after the earthquake, it went to Christian missionaries. And researchers have documented that a large number of these organizations were denying aid to non-Christians and specifically to Voodoo practitioners. And so, as you can imagine, in these dire circumstances where everything is just devastated, especially around the Capitol, supplies are really hard to find, to have this kind of discrimination based on your religion is really a very, very serious thing. But then things escalated even further, and later that year, we have the start of what became the largest cholera outbreak in the world. And somewhere around October or November, as the cholera outbreak really started to grow, we received reports that were later confirmed in various UN human rights documents that a minimum of 45 Voodoo practitioners in one department of Haiti alone were lynched in the streets because they were thought to have been the cause of the outbreak. They were accused of putting something in the water that had caused the cholera outbreak. And so I start with all of this to say that even though it's something that we don't often talk about, it's not widely recognized, discrimination against devotees of Haitian Vodou, as well as other Afro-diasporic religions, it's really widespread, it's very rampant, and it's based on a lot of misconceptions, misunderstandings, a lot of stereotypes that emerged from a period when the enslavement of Black people was pretty much universal in the Americas, and when part of the shoring up, part of supporting slavery in the Americas was ensuring that these religions were not practiced because religious leaders were part of rebellions, part of rising up against colonialism and slavery. So I want to start with this place of remembering this particular instance of this particular year where there was a lot of discrimination and violence against devotees of Haitian Vodou. And then I want to come back and talk to you about terminology. What are we speaking about? What am I talking about when I say the history of a racial slur? And you'll see a number of different categories here. This is just to kind of help you follow along. So Voodoo, as we know it, is one of a number of different terms that come to refer to a broad category of what we call Afro-diasporic religions in the Americas. It's similar to a term like Obia that some of you who might be from the Anglophone Caribbean might be familiar with. And basically, these become umbrella terms. They become terms that refer to a vast number of religions that were brought from the African continent, developed, evolved over time, and merged sometimes with European religions, especially Catholicism, sometimes indigenous beliefs and practices, but have a large part of their roots in Africa. A lot of the names by which we know these religions today come from originally an African word, as voodoo is. It comes from a Dahomey Fon term meaning kind of like spirit or deity. But over time, as Europeans heard these words and said, oh, hey, this sounds like a good way to refer to all of these spiritual practices in our colonies, which is what the French did. They applied this term voodoo, this term that they had somehow heard or observed being used to refer to in various spiritual practices, and they said, hey, this is going to become the term that we use to refer to all kinds of African spirituality. Now, of course, when I'm using terms like spirituality and religion, this is not what they were calling it back then, right? They were calling it superstition, devil worship, all of these things that we'll get into a bit more. But these are terms that the colonial authorities adopted. And after they started using these terms, they evolve over time into something else. Originally in Africa, these various terms, they had usually at least a neutral meaning, if not a positive meaning, but then Europeans end up shaping them very much and shaping them into the terms that are most popularly, or the meanings that are most popularly known today. One of the things that it's most important to note about the term voodoo is that it is largely shaped by the Haitian Revolution. Now, if I talk about the Haitian Revolution, is there anybody in here that does not know what I'm talking about? Don't be ashamed. I am a professor. A lot of my students don't know this history of the Haitian Revolution. Do I need to explain? No? No? Okay. So with the Haitian Revolution, as you all at least are silently, or through your silence are telling me that you know something about, through the Haitian Revolution, which many scholars now refer to as the only successful slave rebellion in the Americas, just because it's the only one that leads to an independent Black nation, right? In the moment that it happened, we don't know exactly what the spiritual practices might have been that were used in that moment, but legend says that Voodoo formed an important part of the revolution, that a Voodoo ceremony commenced the rebellion, right, that eventually turns into a revolution that eventually leads to the independence of Haiti. Now, the reason that I say we kind of don't know what happened is that a lot of the knowledge that we think we have, a lot of the mystery and rumors surrounding what led to this rebellion actually came from European writings that occurred much later, from colonists who had fled after the Haitian Revolution had started, and they started talking about the superstitions that played a role in rebellion. And I bring this up to just say that when we have stereotypes today about, and I'm sure that you all remember, I started off this talk by speaking about the Haitian Revolution, or by speaking about the earthquake in Haiti, right? Reverend Pat Robertson became very famous for making a terrible statement after the earthquake in Haiti that Haitians basically had been so devastated by this earthquake because they made a pact with the devil to gain their independence from France, right? And this is the kind of language that colonists were using all of the time, because this is how they understood anything that wasn't Christianity in their time, right? So especially starting around the mid-18th century or so, in particular following a rebellion in Jamaica in 1760 known as Tacky's Rebellion, in which African priests were known to have provided various ritual protections to protect the insurgents from bullets, protect them from detection, to bind them together. European colonists were often talking amongst themselves, to one another, across colonial powers, about how African superstitions, as they would have seen them, how Africans are making pacts with the devil to help try to rise up against the institution of slavery. And so this is where we see this narrative coming from, that, as we can see from the comments of Pat Robertson, still exists today, about these religions being rooted in devil worship, and this is where kind of the negative misconceptions of them begin. It comes from Europeans being afraid of them, being afraid that they're going to be part of tearing down this institution that they rely upon to sustain slavery, to sustain their livelihoods in the Americas. Now, none of this might be new to you. The part of my research that is what I've done, what I've contributed to the scholarship, because these are things that anybody who has even a passing knowledge of the history of African diaspora religions hopefully knows today. The part that my book contributes is, where does this term voodoo come from? Because with this, we have a different step that occurs. We've got the African origins of the term. We've got the French saying, hey, we're going to use this to refer to African spirituality in our colonies, African superstitions in our colonies. But the French were using something that looks like, if you go down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, number 5 on there, you see one of the spellings that the French used when they were talking about Voodoo. Sometimes it's V-A-U-D-A-U or something like that. Some incarnation of this was what was being used in the French colonies. And so what I was interested in is, how do we get the V-O-O-D-O-O and the connotation that it has in the English-speaking world, right? So this is what my work looks at. And it tells a very interesting story about the relationship between former French colonies and the United States. All right, so what I found is that we have a big jump from the acquisition of the Louisiana Territory in 1803, before we really start to see any kind of newspapers, books, pamphlets, anything that's being widely circulated, widely read by the public, before we have that referencing voodoo. Of course, it may not surprise you that the first place that we really see any references to it are in New Orleans. And initially, these come from arrests in 1850 and 1851 of groups of women who are gathered together, and they're arrested for unlawful assembly. And these charges are typically charges that were used to try to police enslaved people, to keep them from gathering with free people of color or with white people or with one another, because it was feared that they were planning rebellions, right? And so these women are arrested in the midst of voodoo ceremonies for unlawful assembly, and there are all these reports that emerge about how they're naked and they're practicing these superstitions and they're doing all of these barbaric things. But really what we see is that newspapers in New Orleans are talking about, we're worried about the fact that there are white people here. We're worried about the fact that these African superstitions are contaminating our white population. And what are these white women doing? But even so, we don't see any word of these reports, at least none that I could find. And so to do my research, I scoured all of these newspaper archives that we have. We have these wonderful online databases of just hundreds, if not thousands, of newspapers from the past couple of hundred years. And I wasn't able to find a single one that referenced voodoo outside of New Orleans newspapers during this time. When do we see the rest of the United States, and then soon after the rest of the world, start to talk about voodoo? When does this start to become a popular term? Well, there's a little thing called the US Civil War, right? And there's this important moment that happens in 1862 when the Union forces take over the city of New Orleans. And the city of New Orleans was such an important site. It sits at the mouth of the Mississippi, it's important strategically. And so as the Union forces come in and take over, there becomes this more widespread interest in, well, what's happening in Union-controlled New Orleans? And the narrative within a year or so becomes, well, clearly Africans, now that they've been freed by these Union forces, they're just descending back into African barbarism. They're descending back into their superstitions because they no longer have the sibling influence of white people over them. And this is when the public starts to become interested in voodoo, okay? And you can see the second bullet point from the bottom. These are some of the titles of the newspapers outside of New Orleans reporting just general superstitions. There's not even any details about what exactly is happening here. And there's certainly no consistency across different newspapers about what voodoo is at this time. But they start to talk about American pagans of African descent, heathenism in New Orleans, and superstition in New Orleans. Now, what's funny is that one of the stories that really starts to circulate, the first one after the Union forces take over New Orleans, that is featured under all of these titles, again, it's a group of women who are arrested, and it's white women, free women of color, and supposedly some enslaved or formerly enslaved women, some black women. And so there are all these reports about how this is what happens when people are freed from the constraints of slavery, right? From these civilizing forces. Well, later reports in New Orleans newspapers disclose the fact that the women were actually performing rituals to try to restore the Confederacy. They weren't engaged in any kind of directly African practices or anything. They were actually against the abolition of slavery. And so that's something that, of course, you may not be surprised to know, doesn't make it into reports about what is happening in Union-controlled New Orleans. So very quickly after this, we start to see reports of voodoo practices spreading throughout the country. They become more and more frequent after about 1864, 1865. And they just start talking about, like I said, how African people, basically this idea that black people had this barbaric, these barbaric practices, these superstitions kind of tucked down inside of them for years and years and years, but slavery and civilizing influences of white people had managed to suppress these things, had managed to keep them under control. And so there are all these stories about how, as you see here in the last slide, shocking recital, freed Negroes returning to the barbarous rites of voodooism. And this is where we start to see just newspapers across the country reporting about voodoo. This is when it starts to become a household name. And something that's interesting here is that you notice that they're not talking any specifics, But if you look at the third bullet point down, they're talking about their heathenish rights, freed from all constraint. They're worshiping their gods of cruelty and diabolism. So there's just this general narrative about what they're doing is bad, what they're doing is superstitious, but no real details or anything like that. And there's a lot of assumptions, and this is something very similar to what still happens today. Something terrible happens, in this case, a desecration of a graveyard. And nobody knows what happened, but immediately the assumption is it must be those Africans. It must be these free black people now. They must be out there doing some heathenish rites. And by the way, this is called voodoo. Well, and today, or Santeria, right? In Brazil, Macumba, right? And so it must be black people. They must be doing something bad. Now, here, and this was a bit surprising to me how strongly this came through. But of course, going into the Civil War, we had the Supreme Court decision that just stripped black people of basically all rights, all citizenship, right? And so after the Civil War, you have to have a series of new laws and then ultimately constitutional amendments that restore things like the right to vote, the right to hold public office to people of African descent. And what we see is that these debates about whether black people are really capable of this kind of political participation are playing out in part in these discussions about voodoo. And it's this idea that they're too superstitious to actually engage in things like the right to vote. And so what you see sometimes is narratives like this here that I'll read for you. While the miserable Negroes, fresh from their voodoo and fetish worship, were being driven in crowds to the registers, the white men, the legitimate voters and citizens of the states, were kept away by the intimidation and insolence of the military mountebanks. And so you see these kinds of narratives about how the real people who are being oppressed following the Civil War are white people, and how white people are being trampled over while these superstitious, fetish-worshiping black people are being granted all these rights that they're unprepared for. And this one really stood out to me. This is a little bit later on, quite a bit of distance from the Civil War here, but the openness with which they're connecting this to voting rights, I think, is just amazing. So this article said, and I want you to note, it's a Democrat newspaper, as many of them were. I think this previous one, yes, The Crisis was also a Democrat newspaper. And of course, remember back then, things were flipped, and the Democrats were the ones who were opposed to abolition, and the Republicans supporting it. So we see oftentimes in things like Democrat newspapers, stories like this that the author writes, voodooism with its heathenism rights holds its place among them, of course referring to black people. They are to a great extent utterly unfit for the exercise of the voting power, and the ballot in their hands becomes a mockery. There's no confusion there about what they're talking about, right? Black people are too superstitious, they're not prepared to vote. Similar conversations happened about the right to hold public office. I'm just checking on, okay, I'm 20 minutes in, so I'm gonna zip forward a little bit. All right, so the right to hold public office, we have similar conversations about this. This is a quote that I'll let you read, but it comes from a dispute between a Republican and a Democrat who both claimed that they had won the governor race for South Carolina. And essentially, the Democrat candidate backed down, and this author of this story said that, well, it's a good thing he backed down because otherwise the military forces of the federal government would have come in and basically decimated the Democrats and then would have left the state to its African barbarians weirdly dancing and howling voodoo among the ruins of our cities. Now, what we have up until this point is a focus domestically, right? And we're talking in English-speaking presses, English-speaking publications. So newspapers, pamphlets, books, things that are being published in English from the 1850s until the 1870s, in fact, the late 1870s, are all focused on New Orleans. And then as emancipation spreads throughout the South, you start to have this narrative about, well, it's not just New Orleans, really all black people in the US South are this superstitious. And especially in places where you have a lot of black people, now that they have been freed from the civilizing influence of white people, and they're gathering together and they're just returning to these barbaric rites. But in the late 1870s, and in particular in the 1880s, we start to have a shift outward. And we come back to this notion of Haiti being this free black republic, right? And so instead of the commentary about what has happened since African Americans in the US became free, we have this new commentary about, well, what has been happening over there in Haiti, this place that has been exclusively run by black people for 70 years, 80 years. How are they doing? How are they running this country? And surprise, surprise, people assume that they're referring to African barbaric rites, African superstitions. This is one of the earliest publications that I saw that focused on Haiti. It comes from a journal called The Catholic World in 1877. And basically, it starts this bridge between the US and Haiti by saying, hey, what we've been talking about happening with this voodoo in the US South, this is something that's superstitious, but it's not nearly as bad as what has happened in Haiti. In Haiti, where we don't have any kind of remnants of white civilizing influence, we see black people just getting out of control. And they also speak about all vestiges of Christianity, all remnants of Christianity disappearing in an independent black nation. Now, the thing that really shifts us to talking about Haiti and basically never returns to the focus on New Orleans in the same way again is a book by former British consul to Haiti, Sir Spencer St. John, in 1884. And this guy was a piece of work. And he writes this book about Haiti, claims to be the expert on the place, and this is one of the first really big publications that gets circulated describing Haiti post-independence to an English-speaking audience. Now, before I get into what he said, which I see a lot of you reading already here, and that's fine, so you can already figure out what kind of a dude this is, but we want to know, why is he writing? Who is he writing to? Well, all the way up through the end of the 19th century and even a little bit into the early 20th century, there's still discussions in a lot of places, even though by now, for example, the British Caribbean, which is where he's really thinking about, has been independent for 50 years, right? There's still discussions going on about, well, but and especially in these places where black people outnumber white people to incredible disparities, what can we do with these colonies? What can we do with these islands, with these communities, like Jamaica, like Barbados, like Trinidad and Tobago, right? What can we do with these spaces where black people are sure to basically govern themselves if they're extended full political participation, full voting rights, holding public office, and these kinds of things? And so Spencer St. John and many people after him over the next few decades are really talking about, especially when we see these publications in the English-speaking world, are really talking about, well, okay, so we see independent Haiti over here. What does this tell us about what we can do with these post-emancipation British colonies in the Caribbean? And his answer is very simple. He says, I know what the black man is, and I have no hesitation in declaring that he is incapable of the art of government, and that to entrust him with framing the work and the laws for our islands is to condemn them to inevitable ruin. And this is the person who we get most of our stereotypes about Haitian Voodoo about today. This is the origin of many of them. So he starts talking about, well, in my time in Haiti, I learned all about this thing called voodoo, and it's cannibalism, and it's human sacrifice, and it's snake worship, and it's devil worship, and it's all these terrible, evil things, right? And it's always this kind of a friend narrative, right? Like, nobody ever actually sees anything terrible happen. Nobody ever sees a human sacrifice, but they're like, I know someone though, a friend of mine who's very trustworthy. He blackened his skin, and this is amazing how many of these stories that they tell. They blackened their skin, and of course they were able to pass. And they invaded this ceremony and they were able to watch while this sacrifice, usually of a young white child, right? Because they're the most sacred, apparently. They were able to watch while this human sacrifice occurred. So St. John's book becomes a bestseller in multiple countries, including the US, England, and France. And this becomes the beginning of really talking about what's happening in Haiti. Oh. And so here, you can't see it very, very well, but this is one of the images that I thought was really interesting. Of course, you see people half naked and dancing with what seems to be perhaps a chicken. It's at the shrine of the Little Serpent of Haiti, and then I can't read the subtitle there, but essentially they are talking about the goat without horns, which is the sacrifice of a child that has not yet reached puberty, which St. John says is central to the practice of Haitian voodoo. So I'm going to wrap this up by kind of bringing us full circle, and I'm going to go very quickly through this part. But so we all know about the U.S. occupation of Haiti, 1915 to 1934, right? And basically what I talk about in one of the chapters in my book is something that basically gives a nod to the fact that this occupation of Haiti has been very well studied. We know how the rumors about voodoo played a role in the U.S. occupation of Haiti. I hope that you all have seen conversations, read things about that to date. And there's a wonderful book by Kate Ramsey that actually looks at the U.S. Marines and what they did during the U.S. occupation to police and arrest people during voodoo ceremonies, to seize artifacts, burn them, and in fact, I think that Dr. Ramsey is still working on a project to look at how many of the artifacts that we have in museums today come from these periods of persecution where police, or where the Marines in this case, were going in and raiding ceremonies. But this is also true of most Afro-diasporic religions. Many of the artifacts that we have in museums are seized from these violent encounters with police and other state authorities. But so because we know so much about this imperialism, U.S. imperialism in Haiti and the relationship to voodoo, I focus in one of the chapters of my book on the kind of many occupations that the U.S. does of Cuba in the early 20th century, starting with the U.S. assisting Cuba in obtaining its independence from Spain, and then the U.S. kind of saying, well, you know, if you ever need any civilizing influence, we're right here to be your big brother, to help you out, right? And so we send these little mini occupations over and over again, and scholars kind of, I feel like, disagree a bit on what constitutes an occupation, and there are varying degrees and varying lengths of time. But we send forces multiple times. And I talk about how this plays out in narratives about voodooism in the US news. And we see in examples like this where there are connections between Haiti and Cuba. And in this case, I wish that I could find this image much clearer because I'm sure that it is very sinister. But this title talks about essentially how voodooism in the West Indies, as it was called back then, voodooism in the Caribbean, basically involves human sacrifice, supposedly in Cuba and Haiti, and essentially says, hey, this is kind of against the interests of the United States, and why are we letting this happen? And then in connection to one of the many kind of mini occupations of Cuba, we see reports like this emerge in US newspapers about how supposedly the voodoo doctors in Cuba, which is referring to a group of people who were called brujos, or kind of witch doctors, these black men who were supposedly sacrificing mostly white children as a part of their ritual practices. This gets described as voodoo in Cuba. Although, as scholars have shown, this has impact on other Afro-Cuban religious communities who have, well, I don't want to say have no affiliation with voodoo, because actually this gets tied to Haitian migrants to Cuba later on. But essentially, voodoo becomes the descriptor for African diasporic religious practices throughout the Americas to the US public by this time. And so this article, and the author of it is unknown, but they talk about, while civilization stands aghast at such deeds, referring to the supposed voodoo human sacrifices, done almost at the door of the American Republic. They're right here, right at our border. These hideous practices appear to be going on unchecked. And these are constantly what we hear people commenting about, these allegations that these practices are going on, and the white Cubans, who are not sufficient enough in number to really keep this under control, are not taking care of things. We may need to send forces back, or we may need to keep our forces there. And this one's even better. Whatever may be said of our intrusion into the affairs of another continent, here at least is a white man's burden from which we cannot escape. We have to go into Cuba. We have to civilize these people. We have to stop these voodoo practices. And then this is one that's just a couple of images from closer to the U.S. occupation of Haiti, and from the actual U.S. occupation of Haiti, and starts talking about the good work that the Marines are doing on the ground in persecuting the murderous voodoo witches. So that's where I'm going to wrap up today, and I just wanted to kind of end by telling you about my work in general. So you've heard about, these are I've kind of covered about 2 chapters from my book, Voodoo, The History of a Racial Slur. There are a number of other chapters that talk about different examples of what the meaning of voodoo has been over time. There's a really fascinating case where in the 1930s, the founders of what would become known as the Nation of Islam were actually described as the voodoo cult of Detroit at its foundings. There is discussion of what happens in the early part of the 20th century, from about 1910 to the 1920s, where there's this rampant concern about white slave trafficking and how it's the worst thing that has ever happened, the worst kind of slavery that has ever occurred, and how voodoo doctors might be out there enslaving white women with their spiritual practices in the US. And I also, of course, talk about the massive waves of Haitian immigration that come with the Duvalier regime, and the discussions about voodoo at that time. And then the chapter that focuses on the most recent period looks at some human trafficking rings that are occurring in Europe today, where Nigerian women are being trafficked to Europe, and as a part of the trafficking situation, the women are taking oaths, sacred oaths at shrines in Nigeria before they're leaving, and they're swearing their allegiance to the traffickers. And this is a part of a really complex practice of oath-taking that has existed for centuries and was actually used as part of slave rebellion. So these oaths have been very positive in some cases, but as most Afro-diasporic religious practitioners know, spiritual power can be manipulated toward any end, right? And so in this case, they're being manipulated for some negative ends, for human trafficking, but these are being cast by authorities as voodoo oaths. And so I end the book with that, and then I have a couple of other works spanning Black gods, law, and African diaspora religions in the 21st century. It's anything and everything you'd want to know about religious freedom to practice any of these faiths in the present day. And then I have a website that I really want to mention, religiousracism.org. We have a page within that where we are tracking cases of discrimination and violence against devotees of Afro-Brazilian religions. It is an enormous problem. Predominantly evangelical Christians are attacking these communities today and are committing acts of arson, murder, stoning, various things that you would barely believe. And so check out, we have what is going to soon be a searchable interactive database. Right now it's an Excel sheet and a couple of maps. But within the next month or so, we're going to have a searchable database published, and you can track those. And you can also get more information about some endeavors that we have to build community projects to protect these religious communities and to alert people about the discrimination and violence that they're experiencing, and also to help combat it. And then the last information there you can see is my email address. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions, comments, interest after this event.